Topic number 3.2, Origins of Biodiversity. So previously in topic number 2, we saw what biodiversity is, richness and evenness of a system, and the implied idea is that a system that has more biodiversity is healthier, more sustainable, more complicated food web. So we saw, for example, that a tropical rainforest, which has higher biodiversity, is going to have more species, more relationships, interactions, and be more, healthy, more sustainable than, say, a desert would be. So where does that biodiversity then come from? Where do we get so many different species on Earth? Well, there's two ways we can think about it. One is habitat diversity. This is where you have a variety of niches, different places that organisms can fit in. But another way we can think about it, more on a molecular level really, is genetic diversity. You have a large gene pool. So Mendel kind of put forward the ideas that we have different variations of our genes, which we call alleles, and that greater the variation, the healthier system. And this is why, for example, dogs that you typically get from the pound, mutts, and so forth, they're more homogeneous or less homogeneous, and so they have more alleles that make them healthier, whereas pedigrees, they are more homogeneous, less heterogeneous, and so they have more difficulties. There's less genetic diversity in those animals. Now, how do we change? How do we get all this diversity? How do we get different alleles? And so within a population, you're going to have people who have the same genes, but different alleles. And if you count them all up, that gives allele frequencies. So, for example, I could look at in a population of humans and say, well, how many people have blonde or red or light color hair? How many people have dark hair? And then look at the total population and calculate what the allele frequencies of light hair or dark hair are. But how did we get to that point? And so what's going on here is that as allele frequencies change, they change so much that the gene pool then can't quite accommodate them and new species get created. Now, I don't want to use the idea that, if some people have light hair and some people have dark hair, that's going to lead to the creation of new species. But in other characteristics, as we'll see, it actually does over long periods of time. So evolution really means that genes, which we all have different alleles, and that the allele frequencies change so much over time, and this can happen through mutations, that eventually a new species will be created, and the genes are actually so different that the organisms can no longer interbreed. So why do allele frequencies change? And this is the great debate that biologists have, and this is why so many biologists think so highly of Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection, or what is commonly referred to as survival of the fittest. This was a method by which allele frequencies would change, and then, hypothetically, over long periods of time, evolution would occur where the species were created and could no longer interbreed. Remember, we said our definition of a species was that they can no longer interbreed and create fertile offspring with another species. So Darwin outlined the steps of natural selection. Now, if we go way back to Darwin when he was a young man, he was actually a naturalist, occupation which doesn't really exist today. And he saw, and everyone agreed, that people could artificially breed animals and plants. Farmers could do that, different types of crops. We all knew that. We could select dogs, for example, that had certain traits, interbreed them, and create a new variety of dogs. Everybody knew that. But Darwin's big leap was to say, I think this is also happening without any human involvement. It's just happening in nature by itself. So if we look at as conditions change, organisms will adapt and eventually select for alleles which are better for that environment. And eventually, as those allele frequencies change, we will get new species created here. And this is the idea of natural selection. And he outlined that there are 5 steps that happen there. First of all, you have an overproduction. Now, because there are too many organisms of a particular species in any particular habitat, we have stress. Not enough food, not enough nesting areas, disease is created and so forth, and this causes competition to take place. Now, competition then will result in different variations, and some will have an advantage and some will have a disadvantage. And they adapt to their environment. Now, let me be clear about this. This is a misunderstanding some people have. It's not that they're creating adaptations or variations, but they already existed. And so because we have a variety of alleles within a population, some are going to be more suited, survival of the fittest, than others. And therefore, if they're more suited, they will reproduce and pass on those traits. This is reproduction, and this will cause a change in the allele frequencies within the gene pool. Let's try an example that may make more sense to you. Suppose, for example, there is a thermonuclear war. Sorry about this, not a very fun example. And people are forced to live in caves. Okay, we start off by overproduction. There's too many people living in those caves, right? And they're having too many kids. And those caves cannot support those people. So we have competition. People start fighting for the available space there. Variations. Now, some people are small and some people are big. I want to repeat this again. Those small and big people already exist. They're not being created. So we have an adaptation. Who's going to adapt better? The smaller people would be better able to use the available space. I mean, they don't have to duck and work their way through the tunnels. They're easy to walk through those tunnels and not have any harm. The big people keep colliding into things. So the small people have an advantage. And they're going to be more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore, over time, the population becomes smaller and smaller. Now, this is natural selection. The idea of evolution is that if this happens long enough, the small people will no longer be able to interbreed with the tall people because they have become genetically isolated. But that takes a long time. So there's a real difference between natural selection, which could be a fairly short-term idea, and evolution, which is a long-term idea. Eventually, you would then create a new species, so speciation. Now, there are two different ways that this could all happen. Natural selection. It could happen allopatrically or sympatrically. Allopatric means that there is some sort of geographical division between parts of a population which has caused them to move in different directions. Sympatric means there is some behavioral reason that has separated the population. Now remember, a species cannot interbreed with another species to create fertile offspring. Now if we go back and look at Darwin's past, Darwin went on the HMS Beagle, a ship. He went around the world. He went all the way to South America, out to the Galapagos Islands, and he discovered that there were many animals on those islands who were very, very different species of similar animals. For example, his famous Darwin finches that could no longer interbreed. They were separated by islands, so he would have said that is allopatric isolation, or what he liked to call adaptive radiation. Now, a speciation example, what type would this be? Let's try another one. So when the Panama Isthmus was created, there were fish, and the fish were then originally divided, but when the canal was built later on, they were reconnected. But when they were reconnected, those fish were no longer able to breed with each other. In other words, when the Ice Age ended and the Panama Isthmus was there, they were then separated and they became genetically isolated. But when the canal was built and they had a chance to rejoin into one big group, it didn't matter. They were already genetically isolated. This example would be another one of allopatric. How about this one? The finches, right? So the finches also was allopatric. Let's try one more. How about the cichlid fish who live in Lake Victoria in Tanzania? Now, the lake has a lot of different habitats in it. We find that some fish, for some reason, don't know why, it's just a behavioral reason, they like to live in the deep end, and some like to live in the shallow end. And over time, those populations have become separated. But they're not geographically separated. There's nothing stopping them from swimming down deep or up to the shallow ends. It's simply a behavioral reason. And because of the behavioral reason, they eventually over time can no longer interbreed. This would be sympatric isolation. Well, this is a small kind of examples that I've given you, but what are the big examples? Well, the big examples of speciation are things like plate tectonics, the movement of large pieces of the continents, which have then isolated different sort of organisms. Now, there are 8 major plates which are moving all along. Scientists believe at one point there was only one continent, Pangaea, and this then separated into 2 continents, Laurasia and Gondwana. And eventually they separated into the continents we have today, and land bridges were created, and then they were lost as the Ice Age ended and water levels rose and so forth. And this would cause new species. So, for example, this is why we see down in Australia, which eventually became isolated from the major Pangaea continent. If you go down to Australia, you see interesting animals that we don't see anywhere else in the world because they got isolated, and then over time the allele frequencies changed, evolution took place, and new species were created that can no longer interbreed with their ancestral species. We are going through, unfortunately, a loss of speciation right now through mass extinctions. Now, scientists believe in the past there have been 5 great extinctions, and they happened over long periods of time. They were caused by comets and asteroids and floods and volcanoes and so forth. So people have the idea, for example, that the dinosaurs were lost in one of these extinctions, and it happened very quickly. No, it happened over millions of years. The dinosaurs didn't all one day wake up dead. Well, they wouldn't wake up dead, but they didn't all die within one day. It happened over a long period of time. Unfortunately, if you look at the loss of species at an incredible rate right now, scientists believe we are actually undergoing a 6th extinction, and this one is different in 2 very important ways. First of all, it's happening at an incredibly fast pace. It's not over millions of years. It's over a very, very short number of years. And it's also, second great difference, artificial. It's being caused by us. So let's take a look here at the other speciation extinctions, right? They happened over millions of years, and now we're way over here in the 6th extinction, which is going on right now.